the fun part is the real MAGA supporters, just the average guy in the street who recognizes, whether they understand everything Donald Trump is doing or not, that he is doing something absolutely historic and unique and world-changing. I've had so many people say to me, well, I actually have to rethink what I think about all of these things because I support Trump and he's doing something that I didn't think I agreed with. So yes, now you can really learn the American system and you can free yourself from British imperial, free trade thinking. So again, this question of the empire of the mind, that's the empire we're talking about. Yes, they have their financial headquarters in the city of London. Yes, they have MI6. Yes, they have all of the economic holdings of the British royal family, which, as you know, are not insignificant. Okay, yes, they have NATO. And for too much of the past 100 years, they've had the dumb giant, the United States, doing a lot of the work for them. But the way that this succeeds is this question of the empire of the mind. Can you affect somebody's underlying ideology such that they're simply operating on the basis of unexamined assumptions, which are going to end up destroying them or their nation or what they want for the future? That's how it operates. And again, as I said before, taking the dollar off the gold reserve standard was the first step in basically saying there's no such thing as economic sovereignty. Because if you don't have sovereign control over your currency, you're on your way to hell.
Take the first step towards online privacy. Get NordVPN.
Tyranny becomes law, rebellion becomes a duty. So said Thomas Jefferson. Go to bit.ly/lawful tax protest or bit.ly/make war history and find out why it is a criminal offence to pay central government or local government taxes in the UK. bit.ly/lawful tax protest or bit.ly/make war history. And let's make war history. Hi, Susan. Thank you so much for making yourself available. I've been wanting... This has been quite a long time coming for me because I've been looking forward to this. You are one of the team at Promethean Action and you do regular videos, I think 3 or 4 videos a week, Promethean Action, and I have the links to your channel and your website in the description below. Do you want to just start by saying a little bit about yourself and then who or what Promethean Action is?
Sure. Happy to be here. Well, I always like to tell people that I got my political start in 1968. You can do the math, I know. When I was in college, but I was campaigning for Bobby Kennedy Sr. in California when he was assassinated. And in a certain sense, that kind of framed my entire political life because I was a very young person, obviously had no idea of what was behind it. But I knew at that instant that there was something very wrong there was something very wrong in my country. And I didn't know what it was, but it was taking things in the wrong direction. Then I was fortunate enough 3 years later to run into the political movement that was founded by Lyndon LaRouche. He's a man who was considered a political maverick. We always say before there was Trump, there was LaRouche, because he ran very independent, unorthodox presidential campaigns, but without the billions of dollars that Donald Trump has and without social media and so on. But he very rapidly drew the wrath of the establishment and suffered the same kind of legal and media attacks that we've now seen delivered against Donald Trump. But what attracted me to LaRouche is that he addressed the question of the economy. And that was really what had drawn me to Bobby Kennedy. And also building on JFK's space program and the hope and the optimism that we had in terms of an expanding economy, reaching our minds out into the universe to discover more and seeing that cut off. And then I ran into LaRouche, and he was approaching economics in a very rigorous way, from the standpoint that it's not about money. It's about actual physical production. Is your society organized in such a way that your physical economy is going to grow, your population is going to be able to advance with higher standards of living, better technologies, and that you can do this with a growing population? And in other words, it wasn't a zero-sum game. And that really struck me. And I was kind of hanging around the fringes of his organization for a couple of months. And then he began warning, this was in the summer of 1971, that we were likely to see a major financial crisis. Now, for those with an economic memory, in the early 70s, we were living under the delusion of built-in stabilizers. Nothing was ever going to be a problem again. We had it all under control. And LaRouche was looking at the disconnect between a slowing rate of growth of the physical economy and what was going on at the Federal Reserve with international currency rates and so on and so forth. And he said, something big is going to happen. And so, of course, on August 15th, 1971, something big happened. Richard Nixon took the dollar off the gold reserve standard, began to float the dollar, and over the course of the next year or two, the entire Bretton Woods post-war system, which had been based on stable fixed exchange rates, gold reserve standard, I like to say it was based on economic sovereignty, because the dollar was a sovereign instrument under Bretton Woods, and the minute you decoupled it, it became another commodity to be bought and paid for by the speculators. So there was LaRouche saying something that nobody else, seeing something that nobody else had seen. That this, because he looked at it again from this disconnect between the monetary financial side, which is where most economists' heads live, and the actual physical economy, and he saw something that nobody else saw coming. So on August 15th, 1971, when I sat and watched Richard Nixon make these announcements, I said to myself, this guy's right. I want to find out more. And I'm going to stick around, and figure out what he has to say. And of course, that was 54 years ago. So I was politically active in his movement. And again, we were like outcasts. We were the outsiders. We were called everything. We were called communists, Nazis, anti-Semites, the whole panoply of things that they throw against you. But LaRouche always stuck to his guns. And, a couple of years as the organization grew and matured and we did more and more of our own research, we rapidly came to the conclusion that the problem was the British imperial system, that it was not indigenous to some American empire, and that in fact, what the basis upon which the United States was created was exceptional and unique and provided the basis for solving many problems in the world, but that we were increasingly being hijacked and controlled by policies and individuals who, whether they knew the brand name or not, were pushing British imperial policy. And that's sort of been our trajectory. Mr. LaRouche passed away a number of years ago, but he lived long enough to see Donald Trump get elected. And it was very clear that we were now in a world where somebody had a similar, if not quite as explicit, a kind of instinctual same approach that we did. In modern terms, of course, people call it economic nationalism, being against globalization, and so on. And those are Trump's basic hallmarks. And of course, being against perpetual wars, which was another critical aspect of this fight over many, many years. And since that time, part of Mr. LaRouche's movement which became Promethean Action, has been extremely supportive of the fight that Donald Trump has courageously and miraculously waged since he came down the elevator, which I guess was just 10 years ago last week when he announced his campaign, and are now that he's in his second term, with at least the top levels of his cabinet and his government. We're not so sure about some of the bottom levels, but the top levels of his government and his cabinet really carrying out both an economic and foreign policy revolution. And in a sense, we're like the megaphone for it, because we've been fighting this fight for a long time. We recognized, I think before many other people did, the uniqueness of some of his economic policies and the passion and commitment he has to his principles. So that we've sort of been, sometimes I call it, we're the Trump whisperers to the MAGA base here.
Yes.
This is what he's really doing.
Okay.
This is what he really means this.
Okay, we're going to get into Trump, right? But I do want you to say anything about Promethean Action, how people can find out about you and what you do. And by the way, I forgot to mention before we started recording that I do a video with Alex Craner and Harley Schlanger once a month as well, who's the president of the LaRouche organization. And so I'm a bit familiar with LaRouche, but not as familiar as I ought to have been or should be, right? And more power to your elbow, to that organization and what they stand for. And one of the things that's really important for me is anti-war. We've got to find other ways of resolving issues. And we may talk about that later on. But please, anything about Promethean Action?
Well, Promethean, we had a certain parting of ways with Mr. LaRouche's widow after his death. I'm going to just put it in the positive terms. We're extremely pro-Trump and extremely pro-American, and I think that was sort of the dividing line in terms of it. So we're very active both on the ground, and I think that's one of the unique things about us, as well as having a website, YouTube channels, other social media channels where we can broadcast out our analysis and our viewpoint. But a lot of it is based on the fact that we are in the rough and tumble of the political fight on the ground. Here in Michigan, I've been very active in the Michigan Republican Party and primarily the MAGA movement. I'll be quite blunt. I wouldn't be a Republican if it weren't for Donald Trump.
Right.
I often talk about the old Republican Party of Wall Street and war and the new Republican Party. And so what we bring to the table is, again, not just some analysis, but the fact that we're out there organizing. We're out there seeing where people are at, seeing what it is they understand and they don't understand about the fact that there are two systems before the world. And we chose the name Promethean because we thought the story of Prometheus, the Greek myth of Prometheus, was very, very relevant. That he was a titan among the Greek gods, but when Zeus decided he wanted to get rid of the human race because it was too noisy and there were too many of us, Prometheus stole fire from the gods to give to mankind so that mankind could develop, advance. And it's a beautiful metaphor if you think of fire as creativity.
Yeah. And also, if I think of what we've all been dealing with ever since lockdown started. Yes.
And then, of course, Prometheus was punished. He was chained to a mountain by Zeus for eternal punishment. Aeschylus's trilogy, unfortunately, we only have the first, which is Prometheus Bound. But we do know, even though we don't have the latter two parts of the trilogy, that Prometheus does get unbound and basically overthrows the oligarchs. So we thought the Promethean image was a very powerful image for where we are right now, because it is with Trump in the White House and unleashing the Promethean potential of the American Republic and its ability to create a world in which other republics can also unleash their potential, other sovereign nations, republics, but other nations as well. We actually are in a similar position of Prometheus where we might actually be able to overthrow the oligarchy once and forever. So
Okay.
that's why was the name.
Thank you. And then I'll have the links to Promethean Action. I do recommend people, if you're interested in political analysis, smart political analysis, doesn't mean you have to agree with it. But I think it's useful to take on different viewpoints from all over the place and triangulate, and that way come across new ideas as well. I'll have the links. Go check out their YouTube channel. And I did say to Susan before we started recording is that I listen to her videos and the ones that is it Barbara Boyd does? Like 2 or 3 times every time they come out. There's so much information in them, very, very well presented and argued. Okay, let's first start. Now I'm going to be a little playful with you, okay? Let's first start with this nonsensical notion that the British imperialists are trying to run everything. Give me a break. Britain is this tiny, tiny little nation with this currency that doesn't do anything. Gordon Brown sold half the bloody gold that they'd stolen from other countries. It's a declining industrial power, no service industry, no military to speak of. I think it has one aircraft carrier that, and I heard George Galloway saying it has one aircraft carrier that works and there's no hot water on it. On that, right? So for years, the sailors are using cold water to shower. That's how advanced Britain is, right? And you're saying this tiny imp of a nation is running the world. Come on. Everybody knows that Britain is the United States poodle.
Well, I think and I know you're being playful. What people miss who say that is a very simple conception, which is it's the empire of the mind. It's not Britain as some physical nation. It's ideologies. It really does boil down to a fundamental question of what is the conception of man. And if you go back to the American Revolution, it wasn't about tea taxes. It was about two visions of how human beings should organize their societies. The imperial idea is that man is just an animal, and there are superior people, either by virtue of breeding or money or whatever, who have the right to rule over everybody. And there is the system of a republic, which is that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. So you really do have two systems before the world. Abraham Lincoln's economic advisor, Henry Carey, I think said it best. He said something to the effect, this will be a close paraphrase, there are two systems before the world. One wants to uplift people, one wants to keep them down. One wants peace, one wants war. I'm proud to say that we are the American system, which is the former, and then he describes the latter as the British system. So, when you look at, if you just look at the history of the United States, for example, of course, we won the American Revolution. We established a constitution, a brilliant constitution. We established an economic system based on the principles of Alexander Hamilton, that your most important measure of wealth is the productive powers of the human mind. And you'll notice we're going to keep coming back to this, the power of the human mind, which is what distinguishes us from the animals, as opposed to, say, the British East India Company, which wanted to keep the United States or India or any other country where you have a backward population simply treated as, chattel labor or slave labor or cheap labor, whether it was slavery or not, and a source of loot, an income stream, a financial income stream for imperial institutions like the Bank of England, like the British East India Company, and so on. So we did win our independence. We did establish an absolutely brilliant economic system. We had to fight another war against the British Empire in 1812. We had to fight another one, and it was called the Civil War. And I have friends who've done amazing historical research in terms of the role of the British in helping to create the Confederacy as a way of destroying the United States, splitting us into pieces, which could have easily been picked off. There's a lot.
Are you saying that the British did divide and rule?
Yes.
No.
Like perhaps India and Pakistan
No.
and Bangladesh.
Like Northern Ireland and Ireland?
Yes.
Like in the Levant? No.
Yes.
It isn't
No,
so.
nothing like that. Yes. Yes. I mean, anybody who's studied history and doesn't want to just put blinders on knows that this is a tactic which has been used over and over and over again. But something happened after the Civil War, which is Abraham Lincoln, despite being assassinated, and I will mention at this point, we'll take a little commercial break. On our website, if you go to our toolkit tab, we have an amazing pamphlet, ebook entitled, "It is the British Who Murder Our Presidents." And we go through the British role in the assassinations of Abraham Lincoln, William McKinley, John Kennedy, and the political attempted assassination of Donald Trump. But despite the fact that Lincoln was assassinated, he revived and set into motion this American.
Forgive me for interrupting you. I just have to say this because I'm hoping some of my cousins will watch this, because I've been saying to them that it was the British behind the murder of JFK. I didn't know about Abraham Lincoln. I'd not looked into it. But I also know that shortly before that sovereigntist Prime Minister of Pakistan, Imran Khan, was deposed and sent to prison by completely illegal actions by the Pakistani military, in the background running the show, Britain appointed a new ambassador to Pakistan, and she had previously worked for MI6.
Oh,
just a coincidence.
Yes.
So anyway, back to you.
Yes. But, the United States unleashed this incredible economic industrial boom, and countries around the world were looking at this American system, and it was called the American system. It wasn't this phony dichotomy between capitalism and communism, which is basically who's going to control the money? Is the government going to control the money, or are the workers going to control the money? But rather this difference between a financial empire and a industrial productive nation, that was known as the American system. And it was seen that there were two systems before the world, the British system versus the American system. And the American system was spreading. It was studied in Germany. It was studied in France. It was studied in Russia before the Russian Revolution. Count Sergei Witte, one of the advisors to the last czar, was a passionate student of Alexander Hamilton and the American system. It was studied in China by Sun Yat-sen. It was studied in Japan during the Meiji Restoration. Now, if you're in the city of London and the British monarchy, and you're sitting there saying, uh-oh, the American system is spreading, and we've been unable to stamp it out through wars, we're going to have to try and stamp it out through ideological subversion. Now, they still had to use some physical means, i.e. they did kill Abraham Lincoln, they did kill William McKinley, and a few other people along the line. But while they were decapitating the real American system leadership, they were beginning to infect us with their ideas, with an ideological contamination.
Okay. Hold on. Before we go into that, we'll go into the ideological contamination, but I'm going to push back. Okay. What you're saying isn't accurate. I know, as someone who's been involved in politics since I was 18, joined the anti-apartheid movement and been on anti-war demos and, campaigned against both Iraq wars, protested against both Iraq wars, and I look at all the lists of the countries that America has attacked, right? It's the Americans bullying everybody, dropping bombs on everybody, and then you're just saying that it's the British as a convenient get-out clause, something that I deal with as a social worker, right, in a household no, it wasn't me, it was them.
Right.
So come on.
Well, we've been their muscle. I mean, in most of the 20th century, we've been the muscle for this imperial idea.
So this is from the film Mad Max. I've never seen the Mad Max films, right?
I haven't either.
All right. This is Master Blaster, and this is the guy with the brains. And this is the guy with the brawn.
There you go.
And are you suggesting that this has been Britain's relationship with the United States?
Yes, absolutely. Because, just something I referenced in my update yesterday was Henry Kissinger, our secretary, somebody who played an enormous role in the United States for decades and decades and decades. And in 1982, he went to Chatham House. I think it was some big anniversary of Chatham House. And in that speech, he said, when I was Secretary of State, I kept the British Foreign Office more closely informed than I did my own government. Yeah. That's how they do it. Whether it's a Kissinger, whether it's a Madeleine Albright, whether it's a Victoria Nuland, whether it's a Zbigniew Brzezinski, doesn't matter what political party. I mean, as is commonly discussed now in the United States, we've had a uniparty. And especially from the standpoint of foreign policy, you really couldn't tell the difference between the two parties until Donald Trump came along. There might have been some cosmetic differences in terms of economics, but yeah, that's how they did it.
Just on Henry Kissinger, according to Richard Poe, and he gives references in his book, How the British Invented Communism and Blamed It on the Jews. Henry Kissinger was a British agent, and he was the one that appointed Klaus Schwab to head up the WEF. And the WEF, as far as most people are concerned now it's presented, is a standalone organization separate from the British imperial elites. And
I might ask people to think about what year the World Economic Forum was founded.
1971.
1971, just when Nixon was, convinced to take the dollar off the gold reserve standard. So the WEF was being set up, with a decades-long horizon in terms of how do we reshape the world? How do we get rid of sovereignty? And again, as I said before, taking the dollar off the gold reserve standard was the first step in basically saying there's no such thing as economic sovereignty. Because if you don't have sovereign control over your currency, you're on your way to hell. And then everything went from there. Everything became, from 1971 on, everything became a commodity to feed a financial income stream. Whether it's your healthcare system, whether it's your transportation system, your energy system. Under the American system, the purpose of a healthcare system is to deliver health. Under the imperial system, all the healthcare system is another sector of the economy to loot and squeeze so that you can feed a financial income stream to global financier elites. And 71 was the first step, but NAFTA was another step in this, the deregulation of our transportation industry. Again, you look at all of these things and they feed you ideologies. And this is where I get back to the empire of the mind. free trade. Free trade is not an American policy. Free trade is a British imperial policy. Yeah, we got suckered. We got fed. People surrendered to this ideology. People fought it. The trade union movement fought it because they represent this kind of productive outlook. That's where you've had the biggest pushback against these imperial policies. And it's why Trump won in 2016 and why he was able to get back into the White House in 2024. It was the blue collar workers in the swing states. I'm in Michigan. I'm in the Detroit area. It was the shift of the blue collar workers for Trump, big time. We went out to the auto plants in 2023 during the UAW strike, and we found even then over 50, 60% of the workers. And it didn't matter if they were black, white, Muslim, Hispanic, it was the same. Over 50% of them were for Trump already. And I think by the time the election came along, it was probably closer to 60% because they recognized there was something inherently, they didn't need to understand the philosophy of free trade. They knew what it had done to their jobs. They knew that it had driven down wage levels. It had driven down the standard of living. It had wiped out the middle class. I like to call it the working class here in the United States. But this is what I mean by the empire of the mind, where without really understanding that somebody has changed the way you think, because you don't think deeply enough sometimes, suddenly you find yourself adopting policies which are not in the interests of the United States. And on the foreign policy side, we've seen because largely of Donald Trump, but it was already beginning to happen, ideas that had been, spoon-fed to the American people, and most of them had swallowed it, which is that Russia will be our eternal enemy, that the Iraq wars were justified. The majority of people believed that in the 1990s, and now they don't. But where did those ideas come from? Those are not American ideas. That's what I mean by the empire of the mind.
Okay, no, I completely get it, right? And I said to you when we were offline, that I agree actually with your whole idea and premise and stuff, because it's something that I come to as well. But I got to push back because people will have these objections, and so that they get addressed. But since the United States has been formed, I heard something the other day. It's only. I think George Galloway said this. It's only been 6 years where it hasn't been attacking some other country. So the United States is this warmongering nation, and in terms of the resource extraction, that model of imperialism, I can definitely get, because I was getting involved in politics when Thatcher was in power in 1979, first came to power, and how the financialization of British industry, British economy hollowed out British industry, and then Clinton put in NAFTA, and then in both countries jobs got outsourced. And also the European Union was set up by the CIA, which I believe was trained and set up by MI6. They set it up so they could run things in the background. And what was I going to say? So
probably about the United States. Oh, you were talking about only 6 years when we weren't involved in war.
Yeah. So was that again infiltration by the British? Surely you Americans have to take some responsibility for what you've done.
Well, first of all, you have to take each one of those wars individually, right? Because there is such a thing as a justified war, right? So let's take World War II. It was by the time Hitler became the power that he became and was attacking both East and West, that was a war that and was an abomination. That was a war that had to be fought. So that is a justified war. Now you could take a step back and say, where did Hitler come from? And you can look at the role of Hjalmar Schacht, his finance minister, who was trained not only in New York, but also in London. You can look at the role of the British elite in founding the eugenics movement, out of which Hitler basically wrote his playbook. So once we had to fight the war, it was a justified war. Why did we have to fight the war? Where did Hitler come from? That's, another historical question. Look at World War I. World War I was a war which was started primarily by the British to ensure that all of the American system nations, all the nations that were beginning to look at or adopt or act on the American system, were suddenly in a war with each other. So, Russia and Germany and France, all of them were beginning to orient toward American system policies. And all of a sudden, everybody is fighting everybody else. And the United States, under Woodrow Wilson, who was massively influenced by the British, by the way, he wrote a book in the 1880s entitled Congressional Government, in which he said, all right, finally, it's time for somebody to say this. We need to change the American Constitution and turn it more into a British parliamentary system. I mean, this is what I mean by British influence. And of course, he becomes president of the United States, who both presides over us entering into World War I and the creation of the Federal Reserve. So again, this is what I mean by the empire of the mind. So yeah, we've been engaged in a lot of wars, but I'll take you to a very important book, and I think you can still find copies of it, written by Elliot Roosevelt after his father died. And I think you have to get the first edition of it to actually make sure all of the good parts are in it. It's entitled As He Saw It. And what Elliot Roosevelt goes through, he accompanied his father on all of the summits during World War II. So it's basically a first-person reporting of what went on inside those summits. And at the last summit that Roosevelt had in Casablanca, what Elliot Roosevelt says is FDR said to Winston Churchill, Winston, we did not fight this war to reinstitute British methods, to reinstitute the British Empire. And Churchill said, what do you mean by the British Empire? And Roosevelt said, 18th century methods by which you take more out of a country than you put back in. He said, what I want to do in the post-war period is I want to take a country like this, and he points to a region, he points to Northern Africa where they were. He says, with American system methods, we're going to bring in capital investment. We're going to bring in, water projects. We're going to develop these nations so that they can stand on their feet and become independent and sovereign. And Roosevelt did not survive the war. He didn't live beyond the end of the war. Now, the Bretton Woods system is a bit of a complicated story, and I'm not the world's leading expert on it. I do have friends that are, but in broad strokes, there was a huge fight between Roosevelt's view of Bretton Woods and John Maynard Keynes. And it was largely Roosevelt's view which prevailed. And if you look at the original purpose of things like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, they were not set up to be these extractive financial parasites that they are today. So some of Roosevelt's vision for the post-war world, which was to shut down the empires, the British, free all of the colonies, which of course didn't happen for another dozen years or so in some cases, end French colonialization, British colonialization, Dutch colonialization, and create a world of sovereign nations. And Roosevelt considered that his partners in that would be the Soviet Union and China. That was his conception. And, he died. We've had reports from people who were in the intelligence, American intelligence networks at that time, reporting that when, I believe it was Donovan, came out and reported to some of his staff that Roosevelt had died, one of them said, it's over. Without Roosevelt, we are not going to be able to carry through on this vision. And it's true. The entire post-war period has been the exact opposite of what Franklin Roosevelt intended. Now, there was some pushback at various points. Eisenhower pushed back a few times, like on the Suez Crisis. Kennedy would have pushed back a lot more. And he did push back while he was president. As soon as he began to get a handle after the Bay of Pigs, in terms of what he was dealing with, that's probably why he was able to navigate through the Cuban Missile Crisis without blowing the world up, because he was no longer relying on his own contaminated intelligence community. But he had a very anti-imperial, anti-British, anti-colonial outlook. And of course, he was assassinated. And then you didn't have any other pushback until you got to Ronald Reagan, whose Strategic Defense Initiative was an idea that really originated with Lyndon LaRouche. And LaRouche worked closely with Reagan during that period of time. And the idea of the Strategic Defense Initiative was to end this psychotic policy of mutual and assured destruction, again, which takes you back to Henry Kissinger, it takes you back to Bertrand Russell, and so on. And Reagan's approach to the Strategic Defense Initiative is, if we can defend ourselves, and for that matter, if the Soviet Union can defend itself with advanced technologies, then the world is no longer held hostage by thermonuclear weapons. So there have been points of pushback. They almost never lasted. And that's why they're so hysterical, why the empire is so hysterical about Trump. Because while they kind of hemmed him in his first administration, and they prevented his return to office in 2021, and then we all know everything they tried to do to him, from slanders and indictments and assassinations, he's back in office. And he now intends to actually do, frankly, what Franklin Roosevelt wanted to do before he died at the end of World War II. Now, for a lot of my MAGA friends, that's a very jarring concept, because they don't understand Roosevelt. Roosevelt is one of the people who history has rewritten, as a socialist and a communist, and it doesn't mean every part of his administration had it right. But Roosevelt had a conception of a world of sovereign nations cooperating for mutual economic development. That's Trump's outlook. And that's not the outlook of the empire.
Susan, thank you. That's fascinating. So what I can see where it fits with what Trump is doing, and it's something Alex Crane has referred to in one of the videos, several videos, where you're talking about the American system of political economy versus the British imperialist system of free market globalism, which is a form of resource extraction. Offshore all the jobs, Britain becomes part of the European Union, offshore all the jobs to Eastern Europe, all the doctors and the scientists and the students and the engineers, they come over from those countries at great expense to those nations. They leave those nations and they come and work as plumbers and builders in Germany,
right,
or in Britain, and then those nations lose those doctors. Okay, it's just another form.
And I'll just mention one thing.
Please.
The overall, in a sense, the global effect of all of this is you're constantly recycling your populations to lower and lower standards of living everywhere.
Yeah.
The only people who are benefiting are that little tiny elite, who are off in Venice this weekend at a wedding. Right? It's this top global elite. And Trump said this, one of my favorite speeches, he came to Michigan during the UAW strike. And he said, I'm calling on people to join the ultimate strike against the global financier elite. That was the most precise I've ever heard him say it. And everybody else suffers. I mean, some of the pushback I get on my YouTube channel, if I'm not very specific in each one, is, how can you say this about Britain? Look at how the population is suffering. Well, that's the point. This isn't about the British people or anything resembling an actual nation. This is an imperial elite, which just happens to be physically headquartered in the city of London.
Yep.
And Windsor Castle. It has nothing to do with the victims of it, which is the population itself.
And what the British Empire is doing currently is what all empires do, is they're eating their own, strip mining the British population, destroying British culture with a mass importation of military-age migrants, many of them Muslim. It's not like the economy is growing, putting them up in hotels. And I see it firsthand as a social worker, where resources are being allocated to them versus to Britons. And what that does, it sets people against each other as more and more people struggle for diminishing resources or static resources. So you create conflict and you have divide and rule at a lower level to what the British did with India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan, or what they did with the Ottoman Empire, breaking it up and depositing this Zionist entity, which they created and fostered, make sure that the people in these oil and gas rich nations never united against their imperial overlords. And then Northern Ireland, like Catholics and Protestants can't live together? Really?
Yeah, I thought we dealt with that after the 30 Years' War.
That's right. It's insane. Now, I want to, I don't know if you're familiar with the whole concept of fractals.
Not probably with too much.
Very good. And, okay, I'll tell you, it's very, very good, right? And there may be people watching who won't know, so I'll explain. I talk about it regularly. So fractals are self-repeating patterns at different orders of scale. So, for example, the Norwegian coastline, if you look at it from outer space, it's crinkly. It's got that shape. If you look at it from the sky, it's still crinkly. If you look at it, if you stand on the coast and you look between your feet, it's still crinkly at all measures of scale. Here's another one. During one of the conversations that I often deal with as a child protection social worker is where, say in domestic abuse, usually the man, sometimes the woman, but usually the man, women do it differently, is saying to the woman, I'll tell you when you can go out. I'll tell you what you can wear. don't have an independent income, I'll give you a little bit of pin money. I'll tell you who you can hang out with and who you can socialize with and how long for. And I'm doing all this for your good.
Mm-hmm.
That conversation is a conversation for abuse where one person exerts control over the sovereignty and autonomy and independence of another.
Right.
It was the same conversation and a larger fractal by governments during lockdown.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you when you can go out. I'll tell you what you can wear, who you can mix with, how long you can go out for. You can't go to work, we'll give you a little bit of furlough or whatever, right? And we're doing this for your own good. So, because essentially, whether it's you and me or in a household, or whether it's, prime ministers and presidents talking to each other, it's all human beings. It's all human beings having conversations. So conversations occur at different scales. And one heuristic that I use to look at global politics, and I'm not saying it's the truth, but sometimes I find it useful, that whether it's Putin, whether it's Trump, whether it's that midget Starmer, or Macron, or Ursula von der Leyen, or Xi Jinping, or Traore in Burkina Faso, they're all gangsters struggling for sovereignty over turf. And the turf might be, for Traore, it might just be Burkina Faso. He wants control over that bit of turf. It's no different to gangsters in a city. Now,
Mm-hmm.
it's useful where it's useful and it's useful where it's not, because you and I
Right.
have a preference for. I'd rather have Traore running the country than Keir Starmer running the country, right?
Right. Right.
Right. But nevertheless, they're struggling over turf. Now, one of the things that I deal with domestic abuse a lot, and what happens is, guys in a household abusing the woman might be great with the kids, but he abuses the woman, that's harmful for the kids. And he may physically abuse her, take her money, manage her finances and everything, beat her, all of that, right? And then at some point, the woman says no, gets support from other services, and out he goes. And do you know what he does? She's more at risk then,
Mm-hmm.
when he leaves, of being killed or beaten,
Mm-hmm.
but he will still be on the outside, exerting control through whatever means. Stalking, exerting financial control, bad-mouthing her to social services and other agencies, still out to exert control, going through courts for contact and custody of the children, not acting like a co-parent. Okay, we're now
Mm-hmm.
separated, let's work together for the sake of the children. Not like that at all. It's an abusive relationship conducted from at a distance, using manipulative mechanisms. So, on a fractal level, after the Second World War, Britain, the abuser, stopped extracting and physically abusing and robbing and beating its colonial subjects. But then what it did, it left, and it used manipulative mechanisms, subterfuge, proxies, in order to keep extracting wealth from its former
Right.
colonies.
Right.
So,
And that largely is, the increasingly financialized global financial system. It took a giant ratchet in 1971. Because if you look at most of the so-called advanced sector, and including the defeated powers in World War II, Germany and Japan, they all experienced genuine economic growth. Not as robust as it could have been, but nonetheless, between the end of World War II and 1971. But pretty much at the point that the colonial nations got their political freedom in Africa and elsewhere, is precisely the point at which this financial empire, City of London, Wall Street, was reasserting its powers. So many of these formerly colonial nations got their political independence. They've never had economic independence.
no,
Never.
that's right. And then the British undermining political independence. I noticed during lockdown how there were all these elites people from Pakistani and Indian elite families in positions of power. In Ireland, Varadkar, and in Britain, Sunak and Hamza Yusuf, and all of
Right.
a sudden. So again, by proxies, which is how this small nation, through proxies, was able to rule over such a large territory and steal the wealth from those nations.
Yes.
So,
And get nations to do it to themselves. One of the biggest challenges I have right now with the MAGA base is getting them to understand why Donald Trump is not hysterical about raising the debt ceiling. because this whole question of balancing the federal budget. Now, obviously, we shouldn't be printing money like there's no tomorrow in order to bail out, derivatives and other exotic financial institutions. We shouldn't be printing money for idiotic Green New Deal schemes and so on and so forth. But there's a fundamental difference between a government which issues credit that can be directed to real development, as we did in the United States with the Transcontinental Railroad, as we did with the Tennessee Valley Authority. Those are things where, as Hamilton said, you can issue debt as long as you are issuing it with the means to extinguish it. In other words, as long as you are doing it in such a way, it's going to cause your economy to actually grow. Now, one of the worst British ideological infections that is still at large in the United States is on precisely that question. Because this idea of an American system, or what could be called a capital budget, that the federal government can have a capital budget. A capital budget is long-term credit which you issue for the purpose of actually expanding your economy. An operating budget, you should try and balance your operating budget every year. But that doesn't mean you never go into debt. And this is, it's actually a lot of fun because, we've been trying to teach the American system to Americans for a long time. And on the one hand, there's a certain resonance in terms of these questions of growth and technological advance and so on. But people always want to default to cut the budget, cut the budget, cut the budget. I always remind people to go back to my least favorite president, which is Woodrow Wilson, who was, in my book, a British agent. We didn't have a federal budget in the United States until Woodrow Wilson. We generally ran surpluses because we weren't sitting there trying to balance the book like a household budget. We were figuring out, how do we deploy our resources to grow the nation? And of course, under McKinley, we had huge tariff revenues, so big you had to impanel a commission to figure out how to spend the money. But once we began to abandon the American system and we began to shrink our economy, then you get this fixation, you're shrinking the revenues that are coming in from healthy activity. Then you begin to get this fixation on the budget. So we never even bothered to have a federal budget until Woodrow Wilson came in. And now almost the entirety of Congress for the past 20, 30 years has been based on the budget procedure, the budget. So what have we seen with Trump? You've had these circumstances where, as part of these omnibus bills, which are terrible, but it happens to be the way we're legislating right now, it includes increasing the debt ceiling. And Trump says, I don't care, because we're going to grow our way out of this crisis. We're going to deal with it through growth. And yet a whole part of his base, especially the libertarian side of this thing, opposes him on it. And the fun part is the real MAGA supporters, just the average guy in the street who recognizes, whether they understand everything Donald Trump is doing or not, that he is doing something absolutely historic and unique and world-changing. I've had so many people say to me, well, I actually have to rethink what I think about all of these things because I support Trump and he's doing something that I didn't think I agreed with. So yes, now you can really learn the American system. And you can free yourself from British imperial, free trade thinking. So again, this question of the empire of the mind, that's the empire we're talking about. Yes, they have their financial headquarters in the city of London. Yes, they have MI6. Yes, they have all of the economic holdings of the British royal family, which, as you know, are not insignificant, right? So you have obviously these physical, yes, they have NATO. And for too much of the past 100 years, they've had the dumb giant, the United States, doing a lot of the work for them. But the way that this succeeds is this question of the empire of the mind. Can you affect somebody's underlying ideology such that they're simply operating on the basis of unexamined assumptions, which are going to end up destroying them or their nation or what they want for the future? That's how it operates.
Yes, and again, bringing it down to fractals, I can see it through how people are groomed. Abusers, when I come into a house and I say to the abusive guy, look, you got to leave. You got to leave. They don't like me very much, and they'll badmouth me. to everybody else how terrible I am, right? Including
Hmm.
to the person they've been abusing. And then some people will buy that because social workers, you know, as far as they're all concerned, are the worst people in the world. So I can see that played out on a much larger level
Hmm.
with the way that the bankster-owned media grooms people to the Orange Man bad, Orange Man Hitler. Now,
Right.
I am going to push back a bit because I've seen how over the years he's been doing stuff to wrestle control away from the United States from under the thumb of the British, uh, retiring LIBOR, setting up SOFR, so that the Americans get to say what the price of the dollar is, not the British
Hmm.
and their European counterparts, right? Um, and then trying to negotiate peace between Ukraine and Russia, and creating this multipolar axis, not an alliance, but between Russia, China, and the United States. And Russia and China have plenty. Sorry, Russia and the United States have plenty of resources, plenty of collateral. China has manufacturing, and it's a very
Right.
large population, right? It's a large nation, so it can compete on a par. It's on a level with them. And then the British and the Europeans are screwing like crazy. Oh my God, we're screaming because they're going to lose.
Right.
Europe has nothing, has no resources, has no collateral. Britain has oil and gas, but because of carbon dioxide,
Yes, you can't do anything
because
with
of
it.
because of plant food, an essential
Yes,
element of
right.
photosynthesis, right? We can't use that. Now, what I haven't been able to square is all the shenanigans that's been going on in the Middle East. Because operating from the assumption that Zionism is a British imperial project, it's this festering sore that the British have created in the Levant. And you know, Witkoff, forgive me here, Susan, I'm going to ramble a little bit, right? So before he was inaugurated, Witkoff got Netanyahu to sign a ceasefire agreement to stop the slaughter of people in Gaza. Then at some point that resumed. The Houthis started attacking Israel. Trump started attacking the Houthis. Then he stopped and he made a ceasefire deal with the Houthis,
Right.
independent of what they were going to. They were free to carry on attacking the Israelis, the Zionists, if they wanted to. And then the whole thing about the Iran-Israel conflict, because there were Truth Social posts where he was saying he wanted regime change. He was on the side of Netanyahu. Israel was going to make Israel great again, and those were his Truth Social posts. It wasn't the mainstream media. And then
Right.
he negotiates this peace. I pray to God that it sticks. But the Gazans are still being slaughtered. And I do believe that he's anti-war because I listened to that interview he did before the campaign with the CNN host. Who do you want to win, Russia or Ukraine? I want the killing to stop.
Killing can stop.
And it's not often I hear leaders of a country speak that way. And then the way when he addressed the WF Davos, talking about
Yes.
beautiful Ukrainian and Russian men that were being killed unnecessarily, he kept saying that. But I can't square this circle. The guy's obviously Orange Man bad, and is captured by the Zionists at some level, and doesn't care about the lives of the Palestinians or the Christians or the Druze being slaughtered in Syria because he's dropped the sanctions against this ex-ISIS guy. So come on, Susan.
Look, I mean, the Mideast is probably, as you know, the most complex part of the world. And yes, the British created Zionism, but they also created the Muslim Brotherhood. So, you know, they've got their bad
And
act.
and just to add, and through the Zionists created Hamas, and Hamas is controlled by the British through Qatar. Yes.
And then we've got the Christian fundamentalists here in the United States, which is a straight British intelligence operation that goes back. The Christian Zionists here in the United States, which is a straight British intelligence operation that goes back to the 19th century.
The Schofield Bible was from the British.
I'm not sure about the Schofield. I'm not familiar,
Fine.
but you know, when you actually look at the political creation of the Christian Zionist movement in the United States, it is straight British. A friend of mine, Cliff Kirikoff, has written a great book on that. So you've got this incredibly complicated situation in the Mideast. Of course, you've also got Trump having to deal with an incredibly politically complicated situation here in the United States, because if he doesn't get his economic policies largely underway and beginning to show results by the time of the midterm elections, and that includes getting his big, beautiful bill through with most of it intact, he could very well lose the midterm elections. And pretty much that's all she wrote, as far as I'm concerned, because that's going to decapitate the first potential we've had in decades to end the grip of the British imperial system. So I always start from the standpoint of, here is this unique historical individual whose intention, as you said, is to end the killing, whose intention is to reestablish a world of sovereign nations, who is dealing with an incredibly, incredibly complex situation where he does not control the Bibi Netanyahus. He does not control the Ayatollahs. There's a whole lot of things he just doesn't control. But what he is trying to do, and what is driving it, is this commitment to reshape the world from the standpoint of a world of sovereign nations and not the empire. Now, from my standpoint, anybody who's human looks at what's going on in Gaza and has to be completely agonized by, some of the worst genocide we've seen in a very, very long time. What is it that Trump could have done in the real world, given all of these different forces, that would have changed that? I personally don't have an answer to that.
He could stop giving aid, military aid. He could,
could he actually politically do that in the United States at this particular point? I think the most important thing that he's doing to change the geometry we can take positions of things you would like him to be able to do, but can he actually do that? And can he actually do that in such a way that he is able to complete this overall mission? Because ultimately, the only way we're going to ever deal with the tragedy of the Palestinians is if we shut down the British Empire and have a world of sovereign nations where we're committed to some kind of permanent solution, which is not going to last for 2 years or 3 years, but we figure out, will there be a two-state solution which would last? That's, but how do you get there from here, especially after what happened, on October 7th and the destruction the Israelis have carried out of Gaza since then? How do you get there from here? I think you have to step back and look at what Trump is doing from the much higher standpoint, which is putting together the combination of nations that, once you break the grip, the geopolitical grip of the empire, can come in with massive economic development. And that was in his first administration, what did he do in his first administration? His first foreign policy trip was to Saudi Arabia. And what did he say to the Saudis? Stop supporting ISIS, because we know the role of the Saudis in all of that. And he put his foot down and he said, you're going to cut it out. And they did. And then from there, he began to try and build the Abraham Accords with all of the complications involved. And, you read some of the books that have been written about the Abraham Accords. There are quotes from Trump saying, my biggest problem was Bibi Netanyahu. In fact, I just heard, who was it? One of the commentators who's close to Trump, Bill O'Reilly. O'Reilly on Monday said that this last Monday he was texting Trump about the Iran-Israel escalation. And Trump said, and he asked Trump, are you going to strike Iran? And Trump said, I don't want to. And one of my big concerns is how Russia and China are going to respond to that, which I thought was very interesting. But then at the end of that interview, O'Reilly happened to mention that he had been involved somehow in the December hostage release of one of the last American hostages. And he said on air with some crazy neocon News Nation reporter who was practically foaming at the mouth. But O'Reilly said at the end of this, the biggest problem we had was Bibi Netanyahu. It wasn't on the Hamas side. It was on the Bibi Netanyahu side. They know it, but they don't control him. And you also have the continuing danger, which may very well have factored into why Trump did what he did in terms of bombing Iran, of the breakaway ally and Israel itself using nuclear weapons. So Trump is in this world where he is trying to navigate all of these things. Now, I could sit there and say, well, I would have done it different. But number one, I don't have the intelligence. I'm not sitting in the hot seat. I'm not responsible for the fate of the world. So it's wonderful that people have, these very pure positions, but I'm ready to give him a certain amount of grace in terms of trusting what he wants to do. And, am I going to agree with or understand every tactical decision he makes? Well, number one, I probably don't understand where it's necessarily coming from. Do I agree with it? Often when you first see it, like on Saturday when we saw the bombing of the nuclear facilities, to be honest, I sat there and said, holy shit, did he really do that? Right? And then you see what he did subsequently. And then you take into account maybe he was actually stopping an Israeli nuclear attack on Iran. Do I know that? I don't know that. But these are all the things that you have to take into account. And I think we're going to have to see the history books when this is all over, in a certain sense.
Who gets to write? It depends who gets to write them, not the British history.
Yes, it does depend on who gets to write. And let's hope that it's us.
That's right, because I know how distorted they are, right? Was it the Indian? My children never went to school; they were home educated. My daughter comes back from the library one day because she's studying about Queen Victoria, and she shows me this book, and it's like, look, reading about the first Indian mutiny. And I say to her, if you read books in India and Pakistan, they call it the first Indian War of Independence.
Right.
Now,
Exactly.
The idea that Trump, I mean, he could have given America's history in bombing and how effective it has been. Just look at Libya, right? That they bombed these 3 sites, and there's some dispute. I don't know which to believe, whether they did any sort of lasting damage or not. And then the Iranians' response was so deliberately feeble and pre-announced, given what they've done to Israel and are capable of doing with their hypersonic missiles. Okay, that's what you're saying kind of makes sense. And I know it's heard several times that Trump's very, very anti-nuclear war, doesn't want nuclear war. That it could be that he preempted, he's taken away Netanyahu's excuse, because he's now saying, look, we've destroyed Iran's nuclear capabilities, so you can relax. And then now Netanyahu is like, oh my God, I need a war in order to stay out of prison.
I need a war. I'm going to be in jail.
And he's controlled by the City of London, of the United States. And then I just want to bring to reference, people don't know that, as well as, Trump saying that he negotiated peace between Pakistan and India, thank goodness. And I notice my cynicism still, that he says he negotiated it, right? So, perhaps would I've been influenced by mainstream media, or I don't completely get this, but also he negotiated peace between Congo and Rwanda. And that's an inhumane slaughter that's been going on for donkeys of years over one of the most resource-rich parts of the world. It's horrific, and people don't know about it, and doesn't get any fanfare or anything. So he's negotiated peace in Pakistan, India, peace between Congo and Rwanda, some sort of hopefully stable equilibrium where Iran and Israel have each given each other a black eye. And I thought, it's not a good idea to fight the other one.
Right.
It's not it's not a walkover. And still, still got to negotiate with his deep state, the British imperialists, the European Union, and he's not in control of Zelensky, who is completely captured and owned by the British.
Yep.
And it's the British that have the 100 centuries old feud with Russia, because it wouldn't subjugate itself to the British crown.
Yes, the Eurasian landmass.
Yes.
Of Alford Mackinder.
Yes, $75 trillion of resources that Britain would like to get its greedy hands on. Okay, all very, on the same page with you, right? Thank you so much. Is there anything you want to say about what else to look out for, what's rolling out? I mean, one of my concerns is Israel could easily stage a false flag. I believe October the 7th was a false flag. There's no way. There's no way you can get past that border and then wait for 7-8 hours.
I'll not to mention the fact that they basically built up Hamas at the expense of the Palestinian authorities. So
yeah, okay, I didn't know that, but that makes sense. Now I've heard that the British have infiltrated the Iranian regime somehow, and that
I mean, I'm not an expert on the interstices of this, but if you certainly look at the British history in Iran, how could they not? I mean, you look at the overthrow of Mossadegh, it's the British. You look at the overthrow. I mean, yes, the Dulles brothers and the CIA went along with it, but
British proxies.
That was one of those things where Eisenhower realized, in retrospect, he was probably sandbagged. but then they came and they overthrew the Shah, and they basically created, again, they
Wait,
fostered
the British
where they could,
overthrew the oh yeah, the British
yeah,
overthrew the Shah? I thought
oh
it
yeah,
was
the
it wasn't
British
the Colour
were heavily
Revolution, was
involved.
it?
I mean, these the some of the historical details of this I'd have to brush up on,
Mm.
but you basically see the British hand, in the Islamic fundamentalist movement throughout this entire period. So for there not to be influence in Iran would be, frankly, I think, unthinkable. It has to be there.
Right, because what they did was the fundamentalization, the Arabization of this largely Shia nation, which wasn't like that before.
Right, right.
Okay, let me just check the Taliban, British as well, or was that one
Oh
bit
yeah.
and they didn't? The Taliban as well?
Hmm.
Oh my.
You'll have to get my friend Barbara on. She can actually give you chapter and verse on all of this.
Okay, all right, okay. Well, I shall do that. I shall do that. Okay, Susan, is there anything else you want to say before we finish up? Actually, one
Well,
other thing. One other thing. So,
yes.
Susan and I had agreed a 60-minute, and then after watching a few more videos, I thought, can you stay on a bit longer? Because I think there might be more richness to this. What about Trump's relationship and what's he doing with the European Union and Britain? It seems to me, and certainly this is what Tom Luongo argues, that Trump is using tariffs to pull Britain away from the control of the European Union because the City of London, although and the Bank of England was set up by the Dutch East Indies Company,
Right,
right,
right.
in order to use the Britain to access empire and resource extraction through now the Commonwealth countries. So it's actually
Hmm.
not the British, it's the bloody Dutch or the
It's true.
European imperial elite.
We used to use the term Anglo-Dutch quite a bit.
Anglo-Dutch, right? So okay, but he's trying to wrest away, it seems like, Britain from European Union, while Keir Starmer is trying to hand Britain over to the European Union. Any commentary on that?
Well, I'm not sure I'm ready to come to an analysis of exactly what Trump is trying to do with Britain at this point. But I think in general, even when you look at his comments when he left NATO yesterday, and he was asked, about Article 5 again, which, kind of threw that out on Air Force One, which freaked everybody out, which is exactly what he intended to do, I'm sure. But then he was asked in his press conference right before he left NATO yesterday, and he didn't really answer it, but he kept saying the following, and it struck me. When I was sitting around that table, I was struck by how much love and passion each of those leaders had for their nations. Now, I'm not even sure if he believes that, given who some of these leaders are. But I
Yes.
think he was saying something. He was saying the basis for all of this is love of your nation. Not this globalist system of which the European Union is obviously a subset and so on. I think what Trump wants to do on a more general basis, and I'm not prepared to parse his policies toward Great Britain at this point, but I think what he wants to do on a more universal basis is what can I do to strengthen again nations' sense of their own sovereignty and their ability to act on the basis of their sovereignty. So, I think that's where he's coming from, however it may be playing out tactically. But that's what he wants to do. He wants a world of sovereign nations. He does not want these globalist institutions at whatever level, whether it's a private outfit like the World Economic Forum or the European Union or the World Trade Organization or NATO. He wants nations to be sovereign, to operate in their own interests. Marco Rubio gave a great speech a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about the question of diplomacy. And he said, look, when you're negotiating with a nation that shares your values, that makes it easy. But when you're negotiating with a nation that has different values, he says, that's where diplomacy actually comes in. But you respect the fact that they have a different set of values, which may be different from yours. But that's where you actually negotiate. Now, that's very different from the entire neocon imperial outlook, which is you have a different set of values, so we're going to destroy you.
Yeah.
And, I think that's where Trump is coming from. I want you to be sovereign. And hopefully as you rediscover or reestablish your sovereignty, we're going to find ourselves more and more in sync. And even if we're not more and more in sync, I think we will be able to work with each other. But again, you look at what he said about Iran at that press conference yesterday. What was it? I think it was the CNN reporter. She was ready to throw an embolism about the fact that Trump said that he's got no problem with Iran continuing to sell oil to China. I mean, the reporter was ready to hyperventilate. But he said Iran should have the opportunity to prosper. I want Iran to prosper. Now, does he probably have opinions in terms of what, form of government should be running Iran? He probably does. But he genuinely thinks it's up to the Iranian people, unless it threatens us. And that's his approach.
Yep.
So whatever he's doing on the trade thing, I think it's always from the standpoint of we're sovereign, we're going to protect ourselves. And it would really be nice if you acted like a sovereign nation, not as a colony of your central banking system or whatever, and you negotiate with us on the basis of what is best for you and your people as a sovereign nation. And in the end, it's going to work out for everybody.
Yep. And consistent.
We haven't seen this for a very long time.
Yeah, and we're not used to it, and we're used to believing the analysis from the mainstream media, and that this is another American president. Yeah. We've seen them all before: the Bushes and Clinton and Obama and Biden and Reagan. Reagan's a little bit different, right? But yeah, same old story. But maybe not.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
Maybe not.
And just on the European Union thing, he had Maloney come over on her own.
Yes.
And
yes,
Tom Luongo points out how he's actually dealing with, he won't deal with the European Union, he's dealing with independent European nations.
Right.
Maloney is a very clever, smart, and subtle sovereigntist.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Yes. Susan, anything else you want to say before we finish up?
Well, I would just say that really the most important thing is for people to think through what is going on in the world from the standpoint that we are in the middle of an amazing potential historical transformation. I mean, I've been around a long time. I've sort of, in a certain sense, been on the receiving end of the wrath of the elites. As I said, I was campaigning for Bobby Kennedy in 1968 when he was shot. I was in Washington, D.C. in 1981 when Ronald Reagan was almost assassinated. I had White House press credentials, and I was at the hospital waiting to see whether he was going to live or not. I watched the leader of my own organization get framed up and sent to jail. We've seen everything that we've seen with Donald Trump in his first term with the impeachments and everything that happened subsequently. The fact that the American people saw through, that a majority of the American people saw in Donald Trump something, even if they couldn't necessarily articulate it, or they articulate it in very simple terms, like make America great again. But the fact that they were able to see through the psychological warfare, everything that was thrown at it, and put him in office. The fact that he has a cabinet that includes people like Bobby Kennedy Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard, from the Democratic Party. We have an opportunity. The world has an opportunity at this point, I think, despite how dangerous and difficult it's going to be, that we actually could end empire. The power of empire. It doesn't mean people aren't going to have the idea. They're going to, still be hanging around and so on, but end the actual power of these imperial systems. And in the coming years, see a world based on sovereign, prosperous nation states. I think I believe that is what Donald Trump wants to do.
Yeah.
Am I going to, as I say, am I going to understand or agree with every tactical decision that he does on the way to that? Is he going to be able to do it, given what everything else is out there, like crazy people like Bibi Netanyahu? The end of this chapter hasn't been written. But for the first time in my lifetime, I could see how this chapter in human history could have a happy ending.
Absolutely. And Susan, from information that I've drawn from elsewhere, we are moving to decentralization. The globalist project is failing, thank goodness. Okay, Susan, thank you so much. It's been a joy and just an education talking to you. I'm declaring that you are going to come back on. I don't know whether you agreed with that or not, right? But I'll have all the links. Please go check out Promethean Action. Keep yourself informed. And, whether or not you agree, it's useful to look from other perspectives because there's always something to be learned. And by and large, I pretty much agree. It fits a lot that I've been learning about. So thank you. Please share, comment, follow Promethean Action wherever they are on all their socials. And between now and when I see you next, all the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you for having me. Bye-bye.